What's going on, guys? Welcome to the David F. Huss podcast. You're listening to episode, 133, maybe? Don't even know. Yeah, 133. Zach just gave me the nod. Today's podcast, I'm solo, by the way. We are talking about how you don't even know what you don't know and how it's fucking up your life. And so I thought this would be a good podcast because it recently came into my awareness that I had been exhibiting a bunch of behaviors, and I still am. I'm still working on getting through them, all around this idea of avoiding sadness. And I didn't even really know I was doing it until I had this incident with my daughter. I've been talking about a lot of this on the podcast where she doesn't want to go to school. And I'm reading this book called The Conscious Parenting Map. And basically they're saying it's not about your kid, it's about you, which is, I should have known that because one of the cornerstones of my teaching is never what's going on out there. It's always about what's going on in here. And so in that recognition, I was doing my group call one night with my coaching group. And one of the members of my group said to me, well, what is it that you're avoiding? And I'm like, oh, like that was it. That was the nail on the head, because what I was avoiding was the sadness. And then once I came to this awareness that I was avoiding sadness, I started noticing where I was avoiding sadness everywhere. Every time I would feel any bit of low, a little bit of depression, let's call it, if and depression is essentially just perpetuated sadness. Anytime I was feeling like really, really low, I was immediately seeking to get out of that low, which seems obvious, but the ways in which I was trying to avoid that pain are huge limits to me living my fullest life. And so what I thought would this be a good podcast today would be to go through some of the ways we are avoiding sadness. And the reason I kind of I'm coining this thing, you don't even know what you don't know, is because most of the limitations that we have that are limiting us, when I say limitations, I mean limiting us from living our best life, being in the state of joy. If you're not in the state of joy at all times, then you need to keep listening to this podcast, because this is the ultimate state that we are after. And I know very, very few people that are just genuinely happy in life, right? And so the goal of this continual unpacking and looking within and trying to recognize limitations is so that we can move to these higher states of consciousness. And so that's why I'm on this journey to constantly try and keep looking. And I'm grateful that I was able to have this uncovered because I was completely unaware of it. I was completely unaware that I was avoiding sadness at all costs. And I was also unaware of the behaviors that I had created to avoid that sadness. So in today's podcast, what I want to do is I want to point out some of the behaviors that I had, just speaking from my own experience. And then as you are listening, some of your own behaviors that you may be using may be coming into your awareness. And this is always the first step, is to create awareness. And once we have awareness, then we make the link. Once I had the awareness that I was avoiding, actually using the mechanism of avoidance, and this was revealed to me through dropping my daughter off. I wanted to pawn it off onto my wife and said, you're doing this from now on. I don't want to do this anymore. That was just a tool that I used to not feel pain, not feel the pain of being sad. When I dropped my daughter off and she would cry, I would feel sad. So the tool that I used was to avoid. Now I started recognizing that I had been using that tool over and over and over again in my life. I've been using the tool of actually avoiding to not feel sadness. And so with that link, now every time I catch myself avoiding pain, I can just pull myself out of it with that awareness alone. But the second step is to actually let the sadness go, to feel the sadness completely. But before we get into that, I want to talk about some more of the behaviors that I'm exhibiting to not feel the pain of being sad, right? And so another one is addiction, right? So anytime you're feeling low, one of the things that you may go to is alcohol, caffeine, sugar, sweets, chips, whatever your feel good food is, or your feel good high is. You may be going to that more frequently when sadness presents itself. And now the wild thing is that it's like not like this big amount of sadness. It's, you may just feel the tiny little hint of the discomfort of sadness and immediately go to the mechanism that pulls you out of that, right? And I know that for me, like the food thing was a direct result of feeling the pain of loss from the death of my mother, feeling the pain of being alone, because I was left alone a lot as a kid. You know, even though I did have family support, I was still in a household where my dad worked long hours, and I was left alone a lot. And that was another thing that was revealed to me once I created this awareness. And this is the beauty of doing this work, is once you create the awareness of something you're avoiding, you'll start to notice all of the ways that you avoid. And so when I feel the sadness, and it's so subtle, when that sadness creeps in of like, I'm alone, I'm all by myself, no one's helping me, I want to go to one of my mechanisms where it may be distraction, where I pull out my phone and like start scrolling. It may be, it could be sex, could be porn, could be masturbation. It could be addiction, like a caffeine addiction, a sugar addiction. It could be an alcohol or drug addiction. And then it could also just be like avoiding, right? Which is like just not actually putting yourself in the situation where you may feel sad. And so I guess what I want to kind of give to you today is like, what is the sadness that you're avoiding? And what tools are you using to make sure you don't feel? So why is it important for us to understand these tools? Because every single one of these tools is something that limits us, right? And so let me give you an example. If I avoided the pain of dropping my daughter off at school, I would miss out on all of the joy of spending that time in the morning with her, right? If I use excessive sugar eating to not feel sadness, eventually I'm going to have diabetes, right? If I use alcohol to get to a state of euphoria out of the not wanting to feel pain, I will become an alcoholic and addicted. So you can see, now these are obviously more extreme examples, but you can see that how this not being willing, or not even aware that it's there, but not being willing to feel sadness could create huge limitations in our life. And so once we make that a connection, we're like, okay, now I'm ready to feel sadness. And the good news is if you create this awareness, the recognition that you're okay in sadness is like a huge step into courage. And on the scale of consciousness, the map of consciousness that Dr. David Hawkins laid out, courage is the critical point where life goes from force to flow. And when you get to that level at 200 at courage, your whole entire life shifts. And so recognizing my behaviors here, I wasn't actually in courage with respect to sadness because I didn't have the courage to actually face the pain. Now, once I made that link that I was avoiding sadness, and I'm so grateful that for the group that I coach, like not only am I coaching them, but they're also helping me like immensely. You know, it's in giving that we receive. And so Natalie in our group says, "What are you avoiding?" I'm like, "Oh my God, I'm avoiding sadness." And ever since I had that awareness, it's just been flooding into me. So the second I had the awareness that I was avoiding sadness, a shift began with the dropping off of my daughter at school, where she started to recognize that the sadness wasn't bothering me. And she didn't recognize it consciously, but unconsciously, she recognized that the sadness wasn't bothering me as much. And the last couple of weeks of school, she was going into school easier. There were still some days that were a little tough, but she could sense that my energy had shifted. And because of that, she was going into school a lot easier. And so that allowed my daughter and I to have, like, the last 2 weeks of school were a lot better in the mornings because we no longer had this, this pain that was like, hanging over our head that we knew was coming every single day I was driving her to school. So this is the importance of creating this awareness. So let's just talk about some other things that may come up when you avoid sadness. If you are avoiding sadness, you may also not open yourself up to feel love. So one of the things is the mechanisms that we create to prevent us from feeling negative emotions also prevent us from feeling positive emotions. And this is one of the ones I've talked about a lot on this podcast. It's like one of my tools to not feel the pain of loss was to keep everybody at arm's length. And I still kind of do it, right? I'm still working through that. But now that I've made this link about sadness, I'm like, oh, okay. I can see that. I just have to like allow myself to open up completely. And if sadness comes, and I'll deal with it. But I was doing that in every single relationship that I had with women specifically. Every relationship that I had, I was constantly giving them an out. Oh, if you don't like this, break up with me. Maybe we should just break up then. All of this language. And it finally took my wife to pull me out of that, right? And to say, hey, like, what's going on here? Like, you know, are we in this together or not? And it was like that moment I was like, oh, I'm always kind of pushing these people away. And the reason I was pushing them away, the mechanism that I had developed was to keep people at arm's length, because I was fearful unconsciously that if I let them in, I would feel sadness. So this was one of the ways that I was defending against the pain of sadness. And so now, as you kind of hear me talking about this, I'm guessing that the mechanisms that you use to not feel sadness are beginning to flood into your awareness. And now that they're flooding into your awareness, you can just say to yourself, hey, I'm willing to feel sad. And if you are willing to feel sad, then guess what? You no longer need these mechanisms. And then you open up the door to feeling real love. And that's what happened in my relationship with Brie, was that she called me out on that mechanism. And with that awareness alone, I said, you're right. I am doing this. I didn't even make the link then, but I just became aware of the behavior. And because of that, we have the most amazing relationship. We got married, we have kids, we have this amazing life. And it was all of that was created out of awareness. Now, the next big shift for me will be the awareness out of avoiding sadness with my other escapes, which would be like with sugar, with caffeine, with distraction, you know, like going to social media to get that dopamine hit because I'm low. I need that hit. And now this is what is happening repetitively for most of us. It's like we are all feeling a little bit low, and we go to our phones, social media, to get that little hit of dopamine. And this is probably the biggest mechanism to not feel the pain of sadness that exists. So probably a great exercise would be to, not go on social media for a day and notice how the sadness comes up. And so just pick whatever your mechanism is and stop it. And when you stop it, and it doesn't have to be forever, but when you stop that mechanism, you are going to have to face that pain. And the great news is, once you open the door to facing the pain, you recognize that it's not that big of a deal. And that's what happened to me with Harlow, my daughter there. I was like, once I recognized I was avoiding sadness, I'm like, okay, well, I'm okay with being sad. I can handle being sad. It's like, in some ways, the feeling of sad, allowing that feeling is actually like very freeing. I mean, that's why we call it letting go, I guess, right? It's like when you finally say, hey, I don't want to avoid this anymore. I want to feel it. The energy and the drainingness of emotion isn't from the feeling of the emotion. It's from the avoidance of feeling the emotion. And so when you finally have the courage to say, I want to feel this fully, the energy completely shifts. And all of that energy that you were using to not feel goes into feeling. And when you finally fully feel, you're free. And this is what I've been experiencing over the last couple of weeks when I made this connection. And I'm like, wow, I gotta talk about this on the podcast. Another mechanism would be like changing who you are, right? And so one of the big things that I avoid, and I think a lot of people struggle with this because it's kind of primitive, right? Is like the fear of rejection, the fear of not being accepted into social circles. And I notice ever since I've made this connection that I'm constantly analyzing my behaviors, right? I'm constantly analyzing after a interaction with new friends, or, I'm out on the golf course, I'm golfing with, some people that are like pretty well off, let's say. And after golf, I'm like, did I talk too much? Was I too energetic? Did I say the wrong thing? And so I'm constantly in this analysis of, am I behaving in a way that is going to get me accepted, or am I behaving in a way that's going to get me rejected? But the real answer should be I should just be myself. And if people accept me, great. If they reject me, fine, right? But I was shifting, and I've been doing this my whole entire life. I was shifting who I really was to not feel the sadness or the pain of not being accepted. And if you really want to get deep on this, this is like a really primitive intuition or instinct that we have, because we survived as a human species through groups. Like if we didn't have one another, we wouldn't be able to survive, right? And that's true today, even though we are becoming more and more removed. Like I think the nuclear family was like the worst thing that ever happened to like society. Like I know this like with 100% certainty that children were not meant to be raised by mom and dad alone. It's just like, because I feel the pain of like not having that support essentially, right? And I'm like, wow, like this is heavy. Like raising kids is hard, right? It's really, really hard. And if you don't have that support, you end up feeling like this is too much, right? And so this is, probably the reason why, people get to the point where they just walk away, which is, to me is unimaginable, but I can see without awareness of that you could eventually lead to that decision, is because it becomes so heavy. So anyways, that was a sidetrack, but anyways, we need to be in group to survive. And when we get rejected or kicked out of a social group, that basically what the mind believes is we are going to die. And so it is a very primitive instinct to try and be accepted. But with the awareness that we don't need that circle to survive, yes, it hurts that we weren't accepted into that group, but we can sit in that pain and we can be okay. And we will find a group that we are accepted in, right? And so we don't have to be accepted by everybody to survive. We just have to be accepted by, the people that are closest to us. And so with that awareness, you can then stop changing who you are, right? And so part of my recognition in all of this is I'm changing who I am to make sure I'm accepted, but who I'm presenting in these social situations is also not who I truly am, because I have another mechanism of let's say caffeine, right? Which makes me overly excited, right? And talking too much maybe. And so that's not presenting who I truly am. So it's like there are these layers that I have to go through, right, in order to get really fully connected to who I truly am. So where I am now is I'm just going to be myself on caffeine. If you like me, great. If you don't, that's fine too. I'll deal with the pain of that sadness. But then the next step will be to get off the caffeine, to get off any high that I'm chasing, to not feel sadness. And then, be my true self, which will be the true version of who I am. And then if you accept me, great. And if you don't, that's fine as well, right? Because I no longer am fearful of feeling sadness. And now, even though I'm saying that consciously, what happens consciously and unconsciously are two very different things. And so this is what I want to expand on quickly, and then I'm going to go into some steps. So once you have awareness, so my coaching system is based on realize, release, realign. And so once you have realize, that realization in itself is usually enough to create a dramatic shift. So like I said, I am now aware that I'm avoiding sadness, and I'm okay feeling sad. That's what I say consciously. But unconsciously, the mind has been spending its entire life making sure we don't feel that pain. So all of these subconscious thoughts, we have, the estimates are between 20 and 70,000 thoughts that we have every single day. Most of them we are unaware of. So the mind is just doing what it does. Most of everything that the mind does is out of protection from pain or death. Okay. And so we may say consciously, I'm okay with feeling sadness, but unconsciously or subconsciously, the mind is still doing what it does to make sure you don't feel that sadness. So while I have awareness that I'm okay to feel sad, I now have to begin to move through the mind's resistances that it's built up over a lifetime. I have to get through those resistances so I can fully connect to the pain that exists. So I guess what I'm trying to get at, to sum that up, is what you say consciously is different than what is happening at the subconscious level. And in order to create real change, we have to change and shift the subconscious because the subconscious is essentially what's running the show. If you think of the conscious mind as the tip of the iceberg and the unconscious mind as everything underneath, it's like the current of the ocean is what is moving that iceberg. It's not all of the wind at the top that's moving the iceberg, because it's only 10%. So in order to change the way you think so that you can change your reality, you have to first understand why you're thinking the way you are in the first place. And the reason you're thinking the way you are in the first place is because the mind has one function, and that's to protect you. And when you finally realize that the mind is protecting you, you can then take your power back. When I say you, I mean your higher self. You can take your power back through the observation of the mind and begin to notice how the mind is trying to protect you from pain. And you can then say, I no longer need that protection. I am willing to feel this pain. And from that, you can move into the pain so that you can feel it fully. And when you're finally okay in sadness and you've felt all of the sadness and you no longer are experiencing the mechanisms of the mind to resist that sadness, then guess what? When the mind recognizes that the sadness is no longer a threat, then it will stop its perpetual protection from sadness. And in that, you will gain clarity. The mind will free up space. And in that freeing up of space, we get connected to all. And that's where life really begins to shift, right? I think my ascension up the scale of consciousness has been a result of clearing up space in the mind by learning how to let go of the things I was avoiding. So the mind no longer needed me to protect. And as the mind created more space, then more awareness was allowed to come in. But up until that moment, there was no space in the mind for anything new to come through, because the mind was so full of this endless protection from pain. And so this is essentially the process of moving towards enlightenment, right? So let me give you a couple steps here to finally feel sadness and become aware of how you're avoiding. So step one is you got to become aware, and you've already done that by listening to this podcast. You've created awareness that you are avoiding being sad. And now that you have the awareness that you're avoiding being sad, you can begin to identify all of the behaviors that you are using to avoid feeling the pain of sadness. And so this shift will happen in three ways. First is you're going to go to your regular behavior after you recognized it had already happened. So for example, like let's say if I was avoiding sadness and I said, okay, I got to start paying attention to, what's an example? Eating sweets, right? And so all of a sudden I'll eat a box of cookies. And after the box of cookies is gone, I'm going to go, oh, wait a second. I ate that box of cookies because I was feeling the sadness from, not being enough or not having enough or whatever it may be, whatever the sadness is. You catch yourself after the behavior has already happened. So that's step one of awareness. And at least you've caught yourself. Step two of awareness is you're eating the box of cookies and you go, oh my God, you're in the process of doing the action and you go, I'm just avoiding sadness, and you can put the box of cookies away. The third step of awareness is to recognize that you're feeling sad. You think about going to the box of cookies, but then you don't go there. And I guess there's a fourth step. The fourth step is you feel the energy before it even forms a thought of, we better go buy a box of cookies. And you just push, or you just push that energy down and it before it even forms any thought whatsoever. And then you become free. When you get to that point, what you'll be left to deal with is the pain, right? And so now in the pain, in order to fully feel the pain, especially of sadness, we have to have the space to do so. And in our modern world, it's like we're never alone anymore, right? And so if you start feeling sadness in the middle of the day at the office, it's going to be very strange for you to shut your door and just have a good cry, right? And so you may have to consciously escape sadness in a more productive way than eating a box of cookies, let's say, and choose to escape it in a way that is not going to, create some sort of, bad behavior. And then when you get home or when you have space, you need to reconnect to that pain, right? And you need to be able to sit in that pain completely. right? And in order to do that, in order to have a good cry, you need to be in a safe space. And this is what we're doing out at Lungo Vita, right? Is like we're creating space for people to get connected to everything that they're avoiding, which doesn't sound very great, but that's essentially what it is, right? And in that, it's freeing. Once you're in the space, the next challenge is to feel the sadness completely, right? And so what you may find is when you try and tune into the sadness, you may not be able to connect to it, right? And the reason you can't connect to it is because the mind is resisting you connecting to that pain, because that's what the mind does. And so step 4 is you have to let go of the resistance to feeling sadness. And so how do you do that? Well, you just tune into how you're resisting. Maybe you're resisting it through the busyness of the mind. So then you just observe the busyness of the mind. When you observe the busyness of the mind, it will begin to reduce. It's called the observer effect. And then you can move towards connecting to the emotion. So the real challenge in letting go is getting through the resistance, not the actual feeling. When you get connected to the feeling, it goes relatively quickly. And then the last thing is that when you finally do connect to sadness, you are going to recognize that the sadness isn't that sad. It isn't that bad. Yes, it hurts. Yes, it doesn't feel great, but it's so temporary if you fully lean in. And so all of us, not all of us, most people have been living a life that is not truly authentically them, all out of the avoidance of a pain that could probably be let go of and transcended in a matter of minutes. And so in order for us to make the real shift, the step 1 is we have to have the willingness to begin to look at the pain that we're avoiding. And once you have that intention or that willingness, then you will be pulled by that intention to become fully free. And so today, I guess the way we'll leave this podcast off is to set the intention to become aware of all of the sadness that you're avoiding and to move towards letting it go completely, so you no longer need the protections of the mind that are limiting you from being the best version of you. And that's it. Thanks for taking the time to listen. If you like the podcast, if you got any value whatsoever out of it, I'd really appreciate a subscribe. It helps the channel, helps me grow, helps spread the message of this work. Thanks again. We'll see you next Sunday.